So as you probably recall, we've been going through and leaving all of our titles uncrossed off because we want to make the app name dynamic, just like we made the text dynamic from the group around the app settings and users and interests. We want to make the text for our app name in different places in the app dynamic so that we can change the app name from one place. We also want to do that with our logo as well. So what we're going to do in our app settings is we're going to make it so that we can change the app name and the logo in our app settings record in the database. So coming back into our app here, into our design, and we'll go ahead and click on our group app settings. And then when we'll check out the names of our inputs. So this is input app name, and this is the picture uploader logo, and that's fine. So on our save button, we're going to go ahead and add a workflow. And we're going to click to add an action. We're going to go to the data section, and we're going to make changes to a thing. The thing we're going to change is going to be do a search for app settings, and we just want to change the first item. We don't need to constrain the search or do anything in particular to the search here because there's only ever going to be one record for the app settings table. Then we're going to click here to add all fields. We only have 2 that we could change. So the app name, when we click that save button, will be changed to the input app names value, and the logo will be changed to the picture uploaders value. Now, if we have everything set up on all of our pages and everywhere where we mention the app name set to look at this record and this field, then we can change the entire, all of the places where the app name is with one fell swoop just by changing it here and clicking save. So first, let's just test that we can get it into the database the way that we think we can. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to call this the Who's Who directory and click save. So I'm going to refresh the page, and when I refresh the page, you can see I can't see my app name. That might mean it hadn't worked, or it might mean that we don't have our inputs set up correctly. So I'm going with inputs not set up correctly. So if I go into my all app settings and it didn't work, and our input's probably not set up correctly. You have to have one of the records in order to find it and make changes to it. So here we're just going to click on new entry and click create. And now I have an entry in the first place, and then I'm going to come in here and call it the Who's Who directory. Let's just make sure no extra spaces. And when I come in here, it now says the Who's Who directory the way that I wanted it to. And it also says my logo is the PronoCoders logo. And that's because if I go into my design and I look at my, let's see here, and go into my app settings here, this is set as a static image. So when I clicked to update the record, it went ahead and stored this static image into the database. And that's what it was supposed to do. So now we want to make this dynamic. So we're going to go ahead and clear this out. And the dynamic image will insert dynamic data. We'll do a search for app settings, first item, logo, and we'll go ahead and process with ImageX and resize. And so now if I refresh my page, this should be there. As expected, this is coming directly from the database. It's no longer a static image. And then you can see that I did not update the input. So because I don't have any initial content in it, it doesn't show me what's in the database. So actually, right now, if I go into the database and I look here, I have an app name. Let me just refresh this data. There's this button here to refresh the data. So you can see I have an app name right now. And if I click save, now I don't have an app name. It took it away. And the reason was because I didn't have the initial content. But then when I clicked save, I said, hey, whatever this value is, go ahead and save that to the database. So this overwrote what I had in the database. So it's important. I'm going to go ahead and click to insert dynamic data. And here it would be do a search for app settings, the first item, and app name. Now, one thing to keep in mind is it's going to drive you a little bit crazy if you have to do a search for first item and then get the app name every single time. So that's why we have the parent hierarchy of data. So moving data through groups and containers, we can move, and inputs, we can move data down the chain and inherit it from the parent. So instead of doing two different searches of the database here, what I really want to do is I'll make the type of content of the group surrounding the two inputs app settings, and I'll do the search here. So we'll do app settings first item. And so now this logos container here, or app settings container, if we were being a little more accurate. Now, instead of searching here, I can clear this out and I can say the parent group's thing. So it seems like this group is the parent group to this input, not this big group where I put the app settings. So it has to follow the chain. Let me show you what that means. I'm going to reveal in the elements tree the container here that has the app settings search is the parent of this group and this group. But these groups don't have any data set on them. So what we need to do is set the content type first, and then the data source will be the parent group's content that's already set. And we'll do the same thing here. We'll say app settings and then parent group's app settings. And so now inside of this uploader, I could say the parent group's app settings logo, and then I can process it with Imagix. And then for here, it's the same thing. I can clear out this expression for my app name, insert dynamic data, and I can say parent group settings app name. And now I only had to do the search one time. I just had to make sure that it was inherited. This makes a much bigger difference when we're working with longer forms like our profile form, but it's pretty important to learn how this works and how data is inherited from parent containers down to children containers and children elements. I would say it's probably a solid 30 to 40% of what I debug in office hours. All right, so now that we have this done, we can make changes to our app settings. So for the last time, who's who directory. So I click save and I refresh and it's there. It's present. They're both here. Now I can go back and I can refactor my other pages and have them inherit their the title for the app name from the record. So if I come into my top element, so my page element for the admin portal, instead of saying who's who directory, I can insert dynamic data, do a search for app settings, first items, app name. And then to avoid having to redo the searches, I'm just going to copy all of that. I'm going to go back into our index page and I'm going to paste and I'm going to change this Then we'll go into our home page. And we'll just do pipe home. We could technically, I think we could go all the way. Let's see. It could make the page names dynamic as well, but that can be a fun challenge. So we'll leave that to you. Come here, paste, call this login and account. All right. And now we can go into our scope and we can cross off all of those pages because we have them all taken care of. So here we go. We're making progress. So that's it for our app settings. Let's just double check our view and activity. The user can enter an app name. That's true. They can upload a logo. That's true. They can click the save button and it saves the changes. And all users, just so as a note, all of your users can see real-time changes when the app settings are changed. So to give you an example of this, I'm actually going to split my screen. Let's do here and choose this one for the other one. So let's see here. I'm going to show you from the database so you can see what I mean. I'm going to come over to my database, my app name here. If I change it here from the admin portal, it changes it immediately in the database. Well, when it changes in the database, it reflects immediately on the user's pages. So if you had a user who's using the app and you made this change in this field and click save, there right before their eyes, the change would be made. So let's name this something silly and click save. And you can see right away it changed it on this page. So just be aware when you're making changes for app settings that they go live immediately. So I'm going to change it back. I lied before. It was my second to last time changing it, but now it's saved. Now that we're done with the app settings, we are going to skip a step. We're going to skip the users here and go straight into interests. So I'm going to drag it up here. The reason for that is both the users and interest section are repeating groups and involve repeating group lists. And the interest repeating group list is much simpler than the user. So we'll start with that one. So first, looking at our scope, let's just explore what the interest is, first of all. So what we can see for each of the interests in the list is its name and its status. Then we'll be able to use this filter up here to enter the name of an interest and filter the list down to that one specific interest. This is in case you have 20 different interests. It'll just make it easier for you to find exactly the one that you might want to deactivate or edit. So then the sort will just be on the name. So we'll just use the name and we'll do alphabetical ascending and descending for sort. And for the edit section here, we'll be able to deactivate. We'll toggle the active status of the interest, and then we'll be able to click the edit button, which will open up a pop-up, and you'll be able to edit the name of the interest. And of course, you'll be able to click the add interest button here, and that's going to open up a pop-up so that you can create an interest. So let's take a step back and talk a little bit about repeating groups more generally. So this is our interest section, and in order to get to the repeating group, I actually think the easiest thing is to type RG in the element search here, and then you can click on the one for interests. Now, I want to note that this is Michael's notation. This is what Michael decided to do with the repeating groups, is to do -RG as a suffix for all of them. Bubble, if I highlight and click enter, it just says repeating group, and then it tells me the type of content that is set for the repeating group. So this is Bubble's naming convention compared to Michael's naming convention. Now, Bubble would have renamed it just fine if I had set it to be of type interest, and then I delete the name. It's repeating group interest. I'm pointing this out because I think it's really important to understand that unless you are doing accessibility specifically, I think it's easier to just go with Bubble's default here because you can type in repeating group and know that you're going to find all of the repeating groups on the list. The biggest thing is to be consistent, but I just want to make sure that it's understood the easiest way to find what you're looking for. It's definitely not in the elements tree. It's either here or by clicking into the element on the page. And then I also very much like the select parent-child options here. Or you can right-click and you can select first parent. That's also very helpful. So going into our repeating group for interests, you'll notice it looks very similar to a group. You have a type of content and you have a data source. And there's nothing differentiating in the way that this looks, but you'll notice something interesting here. First is, I'm going to switch it back here. When I hover over this data source and I'm in a repeating group, it evaluates to a list of things, not just one thing, but a list of things. And that's essentially at its core the difference between a group and a repeating group is a repeating group is expecting a list of things because for each item in the list of things, it's going to repeat itself. So just like a group, you're going to be able to format it and put different elements inside of it, and you'll be able to pull from the data source and show things from the database or your other lists that you might have on the page to the user. And for each item in the list, this is going to repeat. That's why we call it a repeating group. Now for this one, we actually want this to be of type interest, and our data source will be do a search for interests. Now we've done a search for something, I think one other thing in our so far, one other thing, and it was for the app settings. We did a search for app settings and we chose the first item. So doing a search for something in Bubble is the way that we query the database. So we're sending a request to Bubble servers saying, hey, for this app, because they know who we are, which app we're interacting with, for this app, I want you to go and find all of the records for interest in the database and return them into this repeating group. That's essentially what we've told Bubble to do. Now, I might want all of them, or I might only want a subset of the records. If I want to get down to a subset of records, then I can add constraints here by clicking the Add New Constraint button. This allows me to take the different fields that I have available to me and tell Bubble what those fields should equate to in order for them to qualify for my search to be returned back to the user in the browser. So right now, I do want all of them. I don't want some of them, I want all of them. All right? Now, in order to populate all of them, like once I have interests, I'm going to come in here and I need to inherit my interests from the cell into the group that's holding all of my elements. So I'm going to reveal my repeating group in the elements tree. And I'm going to open this up so that you can see. And we don't need the content type in the labels themselves, but we do in the interest container. So this type of content is not set, and we need to make it interest, and then we need to make it current cell's interest. Current cell's interest is like parent group's interest. It's just what it's called when it's a repeating group and it's the primary cell. So then we're going to come down in here, and within the interest container, we have the interest name. So we want to change this to be dynamic data. And the way that we're going to grab it is we're going to insert and we're going to have parent group's interest. And we're going to say what its name is. Now for here, for the status, I'm going to pop down into this interest status. So this text is within another group. This text is not within a group. It's just directly inside of the interest container. But I can see here with this plus button that this is another group that's holding within it a text. So because it's in another group, it also needs its data type set in order for it to work. So we'll select interest and parent group's interest. And then the text within it will pop in here. And now we want to show the active. So if I send parent group's interest inactive here, I'm going to see a yes or a no on the page. So if I go into the database, into interest, and I create a new one, and I say interest 1, and inactive is no, and I create, and then I refresh my page, I have interest 1 and my status is no, but that's not actually what I want to show to the user. I want to show them that it's not inactive, that it's active, but my inactive field is a yes or no. When it comes down to it, its text form is a yes or no. So in order to make it say what I want it to say, I'm going to use that if else or formatted as text that I used before. So I'm going to say parent group's interest inactive, and technically if I just left it like that, I could do the formatted as text and it would base it on when it's yes. But because I like to read these things, I'm going to say when the parent group's interest inactive is yes, then I'm going to format it as text. When the inactive is yes, I want it to say inactive. And when it's no, I want it to say active, right? So now when I refresh my page, it should say active, and it does. So those are the only two things that in here, the only two fields that I need to set, except I want to use the exact logic on this button here because I want to use this button to toggle this status. So right now the button is hard-coded to say deactivate, but what I can do is I can grab this expression and then I can come back into the button and I can insert dynamic data and paste the expression, and it's showing red now because the parent group's thing is not set. So there's a group around this button. So if I right click and select the first parent, you'll see that it's inside of this group here, but I neglected to set this group's content type to interest and to inherit the parent group's interest, which I'll go ahead and do. So now in this button again, when parent group's interest inactive is yes, then I want it to say activate. And when it is no, I want it to say deactivate. And I think technically it was created to be all caps. So I'll say in all caps instead. And now if I refresh the page, then the status is active, so the button says deactivate the way that I want it to. So in order to actually toggle the status here, what I'm going to do is go into the workflow on the button, and I'm going to use data and make changes to thing. And I'm going to grab the parent group's interest, and I'm going to grab the inactive field. And now what I want to do is I want to flip it to yes when it's inactive, when I want to make it inactive, and no when I want to make it active again. And there is a trick to doing this. We could do this a couple different ways. The first way is on the button itself, we can say, hey, when the parent group's interest inactive is yes, then I want to make it no. And then I can right click and I can copy this workflow and paste, and I can flip it to the opposite and say when it's no, I want to make this yes. And this will work. I can click deactivate and it toggles back and forth exactly as I wanted it to. However, this means that now I have to have two workflows in order to accomplish the back and forth that I'm looking for, and it's always better if we have one workflow. So to condense this down to one workflow instead of two, I'm going to go ahead and delete one of the extra ones, and I'm going to clear out the only when. I use a trick for toggling booleans. This only works for booleans. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, parent group's interest inactive is yes, and I'm going to change this yes and say I want this interest inactive and I want to make it no. So I want to flip it. So this means when I say this interest inactive is yes, then I'll make it no. If it's no, then I will make it yes. So is no flips it to the opposite. So now the same button, but just one workflow, will do the same thing. And we'll toggle it back and forth, but with one workflow instead of two. Now I need to show the pop-up for when I click add interest here so that I can create interest outside of the backend here. So I'm going to go ahead and click the add interest button and add a workflow. And when I click it, I want to reset the data of the pop-up interest, and then I want to show the pop-up interest. So both of these actions come from the element actions list. So I reset the data of the pop-up and then I show the pop-up. We reset the data of the pop-up because we want to create a new one. And that's how we're going to effectively tell the pop-up that it is a new one that we want instead of an existing one. So I'm going to click add interest. I get this pop-up, and now I want to be able to enter a name and then click the add interest button and have it create a new interest. So I have to go into my pop-up and into the input, make sure that it's something I can recognize, and that makes perfect sense. Then go and add a workflow to my add interest button. And we're going to create a new thing. The new thing will be an interest. We'll add all fields so we don't miss one. Inactive will be no. Name will be the input interest name's value. Then when I do that, I want to reset the inputs. And I want to set the focus to the input interest name. So when I create a new interest, I want to reset the relevant inputs and then set the focus back to the input interest name. And the reason I want to do that is I want to be able to add several interests at the same time without having to reopen the pop-up every single time. So now if I reset the page here, and actually I'm going to go in and delete the existing interest that I already created. So I don't have any interest showing, and I'm going to click add interest, and we'll do interest 1, interest 2, interest 3, and so forth. All right, and then I can't click this X button here to close the pop-up, but I can click outside of the pop-up. And that's something that's interesting about pop-ups themselves. So if we go and we look at the pop-up here for add interest, you'll notice that there's a few settings to it. First, it's like any other group. You can set its type of content and its data source. A pop-up is a singular container, so it can only hold one thing at a time, like a regular group. So we're going to go ahead and make this interest, but we're going to leave the data source blank because we're not going to populate the data source until we want to be able to display or send the data into the pop-up as needed when we go to edit it. Then you'll also notice in the appearance settings here, there's a check mark for this pop-up can't be closed by pressing escape. Well, this is also for clicking outside of the pop-up. So I'm going to go ahead and check that button. I'm going to refresh the page and I'm going to click add interest. And now I'm clicking outside of the pop-up and it won't close. And I haven't set up my workflow for that X button, so it won't close. There's no way for me to close it. I'm typing escape and nothing is happening. The only way for me to close it is to refresh the page and then it will load without the pop-up open. So I actually don't want it to be that the person can't escape this pop-up, but I do want to add the action on the icon to be able to close the pop-up. So we'll come in here and I'm going to reset the data when it's closed of the pop-up interest, and then I'm going to hide the pop-up interest. And now when I click this button, it will close. So now how do we use that same pop-up to edit? Let's say, interest 1, 2, and 3. That's boring. I actually wanted to say bubble didify Xano, just like I did in the text when we were setting up the interests for the login, for setting up the profile. So when I click the edit button, I want to open the same pop-up, but I want to use it in order to edit this interest instead of creating a new one. So the first thing is I'm going to come in to my page and I'm going to go to the edit button. So I'm going to look for it here. Having a little bit of trouble finding it, so I'm just going to pop it open here. They're both named button activate, that's why. So this is the button activate that I have already worked on, and then I have this duplicate here. I'm going to rename it button edit so I can find it in the future. I could have also just cleared the whole thing out and it would have named itself button edit. So for here, what I want to do is I want to open or show that pop-up again. So show the pop-up interest. But I actually want to do something before I show the pop-up interest. I want to populate that pop-up's data source with the interest that I'm currently selecting. So I'm going to right click, I'm going to insert an action. When I do that, it inserts the action in front of or to the left of the action I was on. And here, I'm going to select element actions and display data. And the element is going to be the pop-up interest, and the data I'm going to display is going to be the parent group's interest. Now we're almost there, but not quite, because in my pop-up interest, I have this, so it's expecting an interest, and that all resolved beautifully. But here, for my input, I don't have the initial content set up. So what I need to do in here is insert dynamic data and take the parent group's interest name. And then I also need to do something different on my button here so that I can make changes to an interest instead of creating a brand new one. So I'm going to go back into the workflow on the add interest, and I'm going to put a condition on the create a new interest. I only want to create a new interest when my pop-up's interest is empty, right? So only when the parent group's interest is empty. That's why we left it empty. So when it first loads on the page, it doesn't have an interest in there. But when I display data into it, I'm going to put an interest in there, which will make the parent group of this button have a data source that is not empty. So when the data source is empty, I want to create a new one. And then I'm going to go ahead and right click and insert an action here. And I'm going to create I'm actually going to make changes to a thing. And the thing will be the parent group's interest, only when the parent group's interest is not empty. And then I'm going to add all fields here. I'm not going to change the active status, so I can delete that one. And then the name I will just set as the input interest names value. Now, to make sure that the user isn't confused. Right now, with this add interest text, it always says add interest. But interest, when the value is not empty, so I don't know where this came from. It must have been something in the template. We're going to remove this condition. Well, we're going to change this condition. We want this to, no, we'll go ahead and remove it because I think I prefer to do it with the formatted as text. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say when the parent group's interest is empty, and I'm going to format that as text. When it is empty, I want it to say add interest. When it's not empty, I want it to say edit interest. If you prefer to read this as add interest instead of as parent group's interest is empty, you could have left it the way that it was and changed the condition here to say when the parent group's interest is not empty, then you could change the text and say here edit interest. That would have worked as well. It's a matter of preference. I don't think there's performance to be gained here, but I have somehow tended to start preferring this. All right, so now this one will change when there is an interest being edited, and now we also want the button to change the same way. So we'll do the button with the other way of doing it. We'll come to the conditional and we'll say when the parent group's interest is not empty, and then we'll add the text here and we'll say edit interest instead. And I think we're ready to go. So now I will refresh the page. When I click edit, it tells me that I'm editing an interest, and it's interest 1 that I'm editing, and I can say this is bubble, and I can click edit, and it changes it. Now, when it's not empty, after I click this button, I actually want to close the pop-up. So let's go back into our workflow and just say here, hide the pop-up interest. And so we'll reset the data in the pop-up interest, and we'll hide the pop-up interest. But we only want to do this when the parent group's interest is not empty. So I'm going to click edit. And actually, I'll click edit on the second one, and we'll say didify and click edit interest, and it didn't work as expected. Having things not work as expected is part and parcel of developing anywhere, but also in Bubble. So we reset the relevant input here and set focus to input interest name, and reset the pop-up interest only when the parent group's interest is not empty, and hide only when the parent group's interest is not empty. And I'm guessing if I delete this reset relevant inputs that it will work. So let's just test that out. Let's try changing this to Xano. Nope, it still didn't. Aha. I reset the pop-up interest before I hide the pop-up interest. So let's try that. Okay, and that works as expected. So I'm going to insert an action and reset the inputs, the relevant inputs, and leave it and test it one more time and make sure it works as expected. And it does, and I think we're good. This actually might be a good juncture to talk about a little bit about workload units. So we've just set up a workflow that is working on two different states of our database. When we have an interest populated in the pop-up versus when we don't. And so this workflow is starting to pile on the actions. So something that you need to know is when to do this versus when to split them up into two different workflows. I think this is fine. This isn't so many things in here, and Bubble doesn't have a problem doing this. But it is important to recognize that you want to minimize the number of steps in your workflows that you need in order to accomplish any given task. It's also important to differentiate between the tasks or actions that you have in a workflow that are involving the database or the going to Bubble servers versus those that are just having something to do on the browser side of things. So resetting our pop-up and hiding the pop-up and setting the focus and resetting the relevant inputs, all of these things are happening on the browser side or the client side of the interaction with Bubble. Whereas step 1 and step 2 are both making calls to Bubble's servers. Server-sided actions are going to incur a cost. And so you just need to be aware that you want to make as few of those calls as you possibly can to minimize the cost of operating your Bubble app. Now, the cost per action is very, very small, but it does add up, and you do need to be as elegant as possible as you're building in order to minimize your cost over time. All right, so now that we have our interests working, let's just look here. We've got our add interest button working, and we have our table working, although I think the name here and status on every row is very confusing. So the labels need to be hidden. So that's one thing we still need to do. We still need to be able to search by interest name and narrow down the list. And we also want to make this list count here accurate. So we've got 3 more things to do. So let's tackle the labels first. We're going to come back into our design, and we're going to come into the group that's holding all of the labels. So I'm just hovering over, and I can see here, if you look at my view here, I have snap elements to edges, and I show distances on hover. And those 2 settings that I have here allows me to hover and see the size of the element that I'm hovering over and its distance away from other elements. So I know that if I click right here, I'm clicking into this group that's holding this name, which I could click separately. What I'm looking for when I'm looking for the group surrounding all 3 of the labels is I'm looking for the outline of all 3 to go around all 3. And then I can click here, and I can see that I'm in the user's label container. Although that's misspelled, we can fix that right now. All right, so I'm going to come into my layout because I actually don't want this to show on every row. I only want it to show on the first one. So I'm going to uncheck this element is visible on page load. Whenever I'm hiding and showing elements, by far my preference is to hide them on page load and only show them when I want them to be seen. So I'm going to uncheck this element is visible on page load, and I'm going to check collapse when hidden. And then I'm going to come in and make the condition by which we're going to show that element. And the condition is going to be when the current cell's index, that's the index here is referring to the number of the cell in the list of things. So a repeating group is a list of things, and the index is just telling you which number in the line of things or the list of things that current cell belongs to. So when it is 1, that's when I want this row to be, this group to be visible. Now it's interesting. because when I first started recording this tutorial last weekend, we didn't have this element here called a table element. And now we do. So you can go back, you can rewind, and you can look. We had group, repeating group, pop-up, floating group, group focus. Bubble has since added a table element. And the table element actually solves this problem that we're having for you. However, I went and I explored the table element this weekend to see if I wanted to use it in this tutorial, and it's just not quite there yet. I think we might have a separate little talk about it at the end, but it's the only reason to use it is for sticky headers for tables. And it really it's got some bugs and it's in beta, so we won't cover it too extensively. And we definitely won't be replacing our repeating groups with it in this tutorial. Okay, so now we've got this hidden on page load and only showing when the current cell's index is 1, which will make our table look much nicer. Oh, that's way better. All right, and now we need to be able to search by name. So remember I told you when we are in our repeating group and we want to add a constraint so that we only show things from the database that match certain criteria. Well, we're going to add a new constraint here, and it's going to be based on when the record that we're looking at, when it matches the record that is in this search box here. So when I come into this search box, it says search box. A search box is a particular kind of input that is listed to be a particular kind of content, and when you start typing in it, it will find the matches in the database and allow you to select it from a drop-down. So in this case, my search by name, that's accurate, but my list is not going to be a profile. My list is going to be of type interest, and the field that I want to search is going to be the name. So now my search box by name, and I'm going to say search box interest name, is going to allow me to start typing in the names of interest, and I should be able to see them in a list, in a drop-down list. So let's just try that out. I'm going to try bubble, and it shows me bubble in a drop-down, and I can click it, and it selects bubble. So now the value of this search box is the unique ID of my bubble interest here. And that's exactly what we're going to use in the constraints in order to find it. So in my search for interest, I'm going to add a new constraint, and I'm going to say when the unique ID equals the search box interest name values unique ID. And I'm going to, and this is important, I'm going to ignore empty constraints. If I don't ignore empty constraints, when I load the page, my interest will be gone. I'll show you what I mean. So I don't have any interest, and then I'm going to click ignore empty constraints. The reason I don't have any interest here was because this was empty and none of them match an empty name. So now I have ignored empty constraints. I refresh, and now my interests come back up. So now I can type in bubble, and when I select it, my list is narrowed just to that one entry that matches the one that I selected from the list here. And I can easily deactivate it, activate it, or edit it to be something else. And last but not least, now that I have a working table, I want to make sure that I have an accurate count of the list items in that table. So right now it's hard-coded, it's just saying 8 users showing. So I'm going to insert dynamic data because I need to count the things from the database. I'm going to take the repeating group, so RG, interest RG, because that's the table I want to count. I'm going to take the list of interests, and I'm going to use the count operator. And it's going to tell me however many interests I have. I think we have 3 right now. And then I'm just going to put a space and type in interests. And when I refresh, you can see I have 3 interests. And that's going to do it for our interest table. Now that we've finished the interest table, we're going to go ahead and move to the users, but I did want to point out that we neglected to do the sort. So I will consider everything else in the users table complete, but we'll have to come back and do the sort later. That's okay, because in the users table we're going to do sorting, and you can come back and do it the same way for the interest. So I'm going to go ahead and mark interest complete and get it out of our way here. And then I just wanted to recap. In our displaying information discussion, we've now worked with lists and we've worked with filtering. So we've worked with displaying lists and we've worked a little bit with filtering, because we were able to select an interest from the search box and then filter it down just to the list, down to just that interest. So I'm going to go ahead and mark this one complete. There's lots more to filtering and also sorting, and we'll cover that now. I also wanted to point out, in our conversation with storing and moving data, we have now worked quite a bit with using groups as a vehicle for information. So when we're having that conversation in the elements tree or on the page where we're looking for the parent group's information or data to pull it into the element in question, that hierarchy of information, that's the groups at work in order to move information around the app. All right, so headed into the users table, let's just take a look at what we're going to be doing. So our view is going to include, and it's probably easier to see it on this screen, our view is going to include the name and the title, the company and the years of company, the date added to the app, the status of the user, and the actions will include deactivating or activating, so toggling the active status. And then clicking view is going to take the admin to the profile page of the selected user. Then we'll also be able to toggle the sort of the date added from ascending to descending and back. And then we'll be able to filter by the company, filter by the active status, filter by keyword in the bio, and also search the user by name, right? And we'll be able to click this button to add an admin user to our list of users. And so let's get started here. So I'm going to go into the users repeating group. And there's a question here, and sometimes you might find this. You want to share information from more than one table on the front end. And this goes back to the conversation we had when we were first getting started about cross-referencing the user and the profile tables. So every user who has a profile has their profile listed in the profile field, so that you can refer to it by user's profile, and vice versa. If you're working with a profile, you can find the user who owns the profile by looking for the profile's owner. This is what's going to give us the flexibility to have stored information like the email that we don't want shared with anyone and keep it private on the user table, while keeping more public information in the profile table and using only one repeating group to show that information from both tables. So because we cannot sort a table by a field on another table or by some calculation, we're going to choose the date added here is going to come from the user table. I think that's the only, I was thinking through it before, and I think that's the only reason to use the user table. We could technically use either and get away with it, but let's just go ahead and keep it as the I might change my mind. Let's do the profile. We'll do the profile because the date that the profile was created is probably pretty similar to the date that the user was created. And then we can still toggle the active status from the user by using the profile. So you'll see why in a moment. We're going to go ahead and choose and make this a profile table. And then we'll do a search for all of our profiles. And our profiles here, we'll leave our constraints empty for now, so we'll just get all of them, right? And now we need to go in and make everything work with the profile that we're sending in. So the first thing I'm going to do is go and reveal this repeating group in the elements tree. And I'm going to ignore the label container because the label container doesn't need to have a content type in order to work. So in the user container here, I'm going to say that the type of content is actually going to be profile. So let's just rename our repeating group itself to profile. And then our user container, we can call it profile container. And then let's make the type of content profile, and we'll inherit the current cell's profile. Now let's unfurl this one and go into each group and also inherit the profile. And you can do this the haphazard way or the organized way. I'm trying to do it in an organized way. But now we need to go into each of these groups and make sure if there are any subgroups that they also inherit the profile. So there's one group here that will also need to inherit the profile. And we should be good. Now all of our elements in here that are showing the different pieces of information, we should be able to refer to the parent group's profile. So the first one is going to be the name. So we'll insert dynamic data and say parent group's profiles first last. Because as you noticed, it was the first and last name here, Ben Parker. So first last should work. So here you can see how we save time, because if we didn't have the first last already pre-concatenated for us, we would have to say parent group's profiles first, space, and then parent group's profiles last. And this just makes it much easier. Now we want the title, so we can say parent group's profiles title. For the company, we'll say parent group's profiles company. Years of company, we're only going to make the digit here dynamic, so we'll insert dynamic data, parent group's profile, years of company. For the date added, we'll take the parent group's profiles creation date, and here I think it defaults to this, but we'll just go ahead and say formatted as 7/30/23. For the status, here is where we're going to start switching the tables. So we're going to say parent group's profiles owners inactive, and then we're going to format as text. If it's inactive, we're going to say, let's say parent group's inactive. Let's delete this and say parent group's inactive, and then say is yes. So if it's inactive, then we'll say inactive. And if it's not inactive, then we will say active. And technically, I could have just gone without saying is yes here. I could say parent group's profiles owner inactive, and it would have defaulted to yes, and I'd get the same results, but I think this is more readable. All right, now for our buttons. For the deactivate, I actually can take this same expression, and I can insert dynamic data here, and I can paste. If it's an active, I want it to say activate, all in caps. And if it's inactive, I wanted to say deactivate. Or if it's active, I wanted to say deactivate. All right. And then looking for the other button here, this is just an action. So I'm going to add a workflow. And I'm going to go ahead and navigate, go to page. The destination will be the profile page, and the data to send will be the parent group's profile. And right now, this will resolve, it will be red because the profile page is not expecting a particular kind of data. So I could just say unique ID here, or I could go and prepare the profile page to receive a profile. So I think I'm going to do the latter. We'll come into the design of the profile page. We'll say set the type of content to be profile. And then we'll go back into our admin portal and into our workflow. And we'll say when the button view is clicked, go to page profile, and now it's resolved to blue. And if I want a quick way to get back to where I was, I'll just right click on this workflow and reveal the element. That'll bring me back to where I was. All right, the last but not least, one thing I did neglect to do is I didn't change out the profile picture. So I'm just going to double click here, and we're going to clear this picture, insert dynamic data, and it will be the parent group's profiles picture. And we're going to process with ImageX. And now if I refresh the page, I should have one profile. So I have my own profile, and it's got my company, my years of company, the date that I was added, the status, the actions here. And I can click these buttons. Well, this button should work. This page is not set up, but the button itself worked. And then I need to set up the action on the deactivate button. So let's go do that. Take this button, we'll add a workflow. We're going to make changes to a thing. The thing that we're going to change is going to be the parent group's profiles owner. And we're going to take their inactive, and we're going to say this user's inactive is no. Because remember, when I say, if I take a Boolean value and I say is no, it flips it to the opposite. So now this toggle is working as expected. So that was fairly straightforward. We've been getting used to how to pull data into the front end now, so this was pretty easy to set up. Now we want to be able to sort, which actually means we're going to want to add another profile to the list here. So I'm going to log out, if it will let me. Let's see here. Which is going to take me to the home page. I'm going to go to create an account, and I'm going to sign up over again. And I will be back after I'm done creating a new profile. All right, I've added a few profiles, so we have something to look at and work with. And the first thing I noticed when I got back is I have my labels on every row, and I don't want that. So just like we did before in the interest table, I'm going to grab the group that's around all of the labels, come into the layout, make it not visible on page load and collapsed when hidden, and add the conditional that when the current cell's index is 1, I want to make the labels visible. That should clean it up tremendously. Yep, that looks way better already. Okay, so the last thing we have in this section that we need to do is the sort right here. So right now, if I go to my repeating group, not the interest repeating group, the profile repeating group, and go to the appearance and search for profiles. In addition to adding constraints, I can also add a sort by field here. I can say in here, I can look for the created date, which is what we decided to use. And then the descending, I can say yes or no, or I can make it dynamic. And so I'm going to use this as an opportunity to introduce another concept that we haven't yet covered, which is custom states. So if you go back up to our storing and moving data around discussion, one of the ways that we can, the controlling the interface discussion, it works into both. One of the ways that you can work with workflows and conditions to hide and show things or change a state of a page is called a custom state. And a custom state is essentially you get to decide what kind of content it will hold. So you kind of set a container and you decide what kind of content it will hold, whether it's going to be a single thing or if it's going to be a list of things. And you set whatever that state is, and just like its name implies, it's static. It's going to stay that way until you make a change. So it's not very persistent because when you refresh the page, you'll lose whatever custom state that you had set unless you have a default to reset it on page load. But it is very useful for remembering things that you need during the session that you don't want to send to the database. Because remember, we were talking about workload units in the last video, and we want to communicate as little as possible with Bubble servers in order to achieve the result that we're looking for. So let's see, the custom state here, you can set it in a couple different ways. So we're going to start with setting it based on, let's see, if I go back into my repeating group. In here, you can say here, and I'm going to do the admin portal, and I don't think it will let me choose that. Oh, it does. Here, so I chose the admin portal, and it allows me to create a new custom state right here. So I can click here, and the custom state looks very much or just like setting a field on a data type. I can say the state's name, and then I can say what kind of state it's going to be, and I can decide if it's going to be a list or not. I can also come into the top level, so the page admin portal, into the page element, and I can click on this information icon, the eye icon here, and I can add a new custom state here. And it gives me the same interface. I can name it, I can say what kind of content it's going to contain, and I can make it a list or not. So I'm going to start from here, and I'm going to say descending with a question mark, and I'm going to make it a yes/no state, and I'm not going to make it a list. I'm going to go ahead and create it. Now I have a custom state. The reason I put it at the top level here, this is something I learned very early on from Greg, actually. We set them at the top level because it's easier to find them that way. When we set states on anything else, it can be really hard to find where that state is to go and change it, or to see how many states we have at play. So more often than not, and I actually give it a 99% of the time, I'm going to put a custom state on the page level so that I can come in here and I can find all of them for that page, and I can manipulate them as needed. So one thing you can do with custom states when it's a yes/no, like a not from the database itself, if the content type is something that's a general content type, you can set a default value. And in this case, I do want to set a default value. If I go to my scope and I look at my my sort for my users, it says that the date added is where I'm going to do the sorting, and it's going to be descending, ascending. And when I have a shorthand in my scopes, whenever I put whichever one of these comes first should be my default. So it should be descending. So I want to go ahead and make this default value here. Is it descending? Yes, I want it to be descending. Now that I have this custom state set and set by default, I want to go back into my repeating group so I can use this value to determine which sort it's going to be. So I'll go back into the profile repeating group, into the search for profiles, and I'm going to choose the admin portals descending, and it's going to say yes by default. So it's going to automatically default by created date descending. You'll notice when I look in here, the original was going by ascending, by date added, because I was added first, then I added Emily, then I added Adam. So now I'm going to refresh the page and it's going to be the opposite. I'm here at the bottom, Emily is still in the middle, and Adam is on top. Now I want to be able to change this arrow and use this arrow to click and change the sort back and forth. So I'm going to come into the page, I'm going to find the icon itself, and it says chevron up. That's why it's up here. And I want to change this and I want to make it dynamic. So I'm going to insert dynamic data, and I'm going to use the state that I just made, and then I'm going to decide whether it's going to be chevron up or down. So which one are we going to choose? The way I like to think about it is when it's ascending, I start with the smallest and I go to the biggest, and when it's descending, it's the opposite. I start with the biggest and I go to the smallest. So this is what I want it to look like when it's ascending, and I want to flip it around when it's descending. So here I'm going to check the state. I'm going to type in admin portal because that's the name of the page, and I'm going to say descending. And when it is descending, when it is no, then I'm going to format as text, and I'm going to leave the chevron up. Chevron up. And then when it's yes, I want chevron down. And then I'm going to refresh the page, and it's flipped it because by default it's descending is yes, so I want the chevron down because the largest, the date is larger the later it is up at the top, and the smaller one is at the bottom. Now when I click that chevron, I want it to flip around. So I'm going to come to the layout here, and I'm going to give it a minimum width of 15. See if that's enough. Yeah, just so we can see it. So then I'm going to come in here and I'm going to add a workflow. And we already know about toggling yes, no values. So really what I want to do is I want to use the element actions, and I want to set a state. The element is going to be the admin portal. The state is going to be descending, and the value is going to be admin portal again, because I'm going to check what it is, descending, and I'm going to say is no, and that's going to flip it to the opposite. So now when I refresh the page, I can toggle my sort up and down like so. Now we want to be able to start filtering this list. So we're going to filter by company first. So I'm going to come back into my design, and I'm going to come into my drop down. And my drop down right now is set to be static choices, and I actually want it to be dynamic. So what I want to do is say dynamic choices, and then the type of choices is going to be text. Because remember, in our data, in our profile, we set the company as a text. We don't have a separate company table. So our choices here should be the names of the companies that people have entered and should be text. So our choices source is going to be the repeating group below. So I'm going to clear this expression and follow me if you would. We're going to say RG profiles, list of profiles. Then we're going to come down here and say each item's company. And then we're going to come down here and we're going to say unique elements. So this is going to look at the list of all of the profiles that we have. It's going to come up with a list of all of the company names, and then it's going to eliminate the duplicates, and it's going to give us just the unique elements in there. That way, when I click, I won't see Google twice, because if you'll notice, Adam and Emily both work for Google. The option caption that I'm going to use is going to be the current options text. So it actually doesn't need anything other than the current option. And I'm not going to set a default value because I don't want to default to filtering by company. So now I'm going to pop back into my RG profile and into my search for profiles, and I'm going to add a new constraint. The constraint is going to be the company equals, and then I'm going to look for my drop-down company. Yeah, the drop-down filter company's value. And I'm going to remember to ignore empty constraints. And so now I'm going to load the page. And when I click filter by company, I can see Google and Pro No Coders. And when I click on Google, it's going to show me just the users who are working for Google. If I had made a separate company table, then I would have searched for companies. But because I left that field as text, that's how I'm going to find it. I'm going to populate the list and be able to filter by it. The other subtlety of what I did there is I didn't want to search for all users and their profiles and each item's company and unique elements, because as I filter this list in other ways, I wanted to make sure that I was only showing companies that would yield a result when it was filtered again by company. Now we're going to go into the is active search, and this is the reason for the yes, no inclusive that we created before. So in this is active yes or no, right now it's set to static choices, but we really want it to be able to come from the yes, no inclusive option set. So let me regroup and I will be right back. Okay, so the yes, no inclusive option set and filtering by yeses and nos. The issue with this, and the reason it is tricky, is because Bubble automatically treats an empty field as a no. It doesn't ever allow you to treat a yes, no field as being empty or null. And when I'm filtering by a yes or a no, it also what that means is if once I choose one of these and I filter by it, then I can't flip it on back to both yes and no and show the whole list. I would only be able to show one or the other. So now what I want to do is I want to set this up so that I can filter by yes, no, or either. So let's go into the design, and in this is active, I'm going to make it dynamic choices, and the type of choice is going to be yes, no inclusive, and the choices source is going to be all values. So it's going to be all yes, no inclusive, and it's going to be, let's see here, and then the current options display. So if I do the current options display, it's going to show me, here I'll just refresh the page and show you. It's going to show me yes, no, or yes or no. And actually I would like for it to say active, inactive, either. So I'm going to come into my data and into my option sets and into my yes, no inclusive options. And I'm going to create a new attribute, and I'm going to call this user filter. And the attribute type will be text. And I'm going to create a specialized text menu for that drop down. So for each one of these, I'm going to say, for yes, I'm going to say active. Actually, for yes, it would be inactive. And for no, it's going to be active. And for yes or no, it's going to say either. And then I'm going to come back into my design, and I'm going to come into this active cell here, and I'm going to change the current options to the current options user filter text. And now, when I populate this drop down, it's going to say inactive, active, or either. Right? So now, in order to filter by that, I'm going to go to my repeating group and search for profiles. I'm going to add a new constraint, and I'm going to say actually I can't do it on this one because it's actually a filter. So we'll have to use the filter property because remember the active status is on the user and not on the profile. And I will only have access to profile fields from this primary constraints interface. So if I come to filter here, then I'm going to say in here, I'm going to go and choose an advanced filter. You have to be careful with advanced filters. First, I don't use them if I haven't curtailed how many items are showing in the list, and I don't use them with any kind of search or query because it ends up taking too long and it's too much resource. So here the advanced is going to say this profile's owners, inactive, I'll flip it around and we'll say the active field. So the drop down actives values, list of yes or no's contains this profile's owners inactive. So essentially I'm saying my list of yes or no's, it's either going to be yes or no, or both yes and no. So if the drop-downs values list of yes no's contains this profile's owners inactive, which will be a yes or no, then it will be showing. It will show. So I'm going to ignore empty constraints, and I'm not sure if ignoring empty constraints here is going to work or if I'm going to have to add a conditional. Let's just check it out here. So it doesn't, it breaks it. So here we're going to copy this expression, and then I'm going to go ahead and delete the filter altogether, and I'm going to come into the conditional, and I'm going to say when the drop-down active value is not empty, then I'm going to change the data source. The data source, I can copy this expression and bring it in here and paste, and now I can add my filter and say add the constraint where it's advanced, and I say this profile, the drop-down actives values list of yes no's contains this profile's owners inactive. So we fixed the page flow. We have our values here. We can go ahead and filter by the company, and now I can filter by the active. I can say inactive. None of them are inactive, that's why it disappeared. I can say active and they all appear, and I can say either and they all stay appearing. So now I'm going to deactivate Emily, and I'm going to say only active, and it will only show me the active users, and only inactive, and it shows me the only inactive user. And so I know it's a bit complicated, but I did want to show you the ability to add attributes and lists within the attributes of an option set, how that makes our drop-downs much more powerful and flexible, and also working with filtering yeses and nos. So it's a little bit of an advanced concept, but now you know. Now let's go into the keyword search. Heading back into the design. For the keyword search, it's pretty simple. The keyword search is going to be a text input, and we're going to go back into our repeating group and into our search for profiles, and we're going to add a new constraint. And I think your first inclination, what might be intuitive, is to go ahead and search the bio by the keyword entered. But actually, I'm going to choose the any field, and I choose the any field here for a particular reason. The any field is a special field that you do not have access to change outside of it is automatically created whenever you create a text or number field. So when I create the any field, it is not case sensitive, and this means that every field that I add that has just plain text in it, that's not a reference field like with a unique ID for another record in the database, whenever I do that, it's going to add it into this any field, which becomes searchable, and it's going to yield much better results than just looking for the bio and just looking for other fields. So I'm going to search any field based on contains the input keywords value. And so if I come in and I refresh the page and I do my keyword search, I can say, I realize I'm not showing the bio here anywhere. So let me just try to remember what I said, fall, and I have one user that has fall in their bio because Adam Jameson loves fall apparently. All right, but you'll notice there was like a hiccup there. When I typed it, it hung up for a second. I don't have anything and then I have something. And we really want to avoid that hiccup or that delay. The other thing that you'll notice here is if I come here and I do my inactive and then I do my keyword search, nothing's going to happen. Because remember, I switch the data source out when this field is not empty. So I'm going to come back in here and I'm going to go and copy this expression from my data source on the profile repeating group here, and I'm going to, well actually I'll just add the constraint here as well. The any field contains the input keywords value. That way it will work even when I'm filtering by the active status. So I can say fall and it shows up. Now I want to bypass this hiccup that we have. And what's actually happening with the hiccup is that Bubble waits for just a few moments for you to stop typing before it makes the value of the input available to the repeating group. And this actually helps to prevent searching the database too much. Like for every keystroke, you don't want to send new queries to the database. But when we're using it this way, it shouldn't be a problem. I mean, I guess we can test the workload units. So what I want to do to avoid this is I actually want to install a plugin that I don't think I have currently installed called Input Watch. So just go, I'm going to do 1T. 1T is, or T1 is going to pull up So Input Watcher, 1T Input Watcher. This is a plugin by Eli Beachy. I love Eli. Worked with him for a long time. So I'm going to install this plugin, and what it's going to allow me to do is instantly know what the value of that input is. So click Done here. And I'm going to come into my design and I'm going to look for this watch input, and I'm just going to drag it inside this group here, just very tiny. Won't even notice that it's there. Now this is going to require me to use an input ID, which is going to be an ID attribute here at the bottom of the input that I'm looking at. So this is the input I'm looking at, and I'm going to just take this ID attribute and I'm going to say keyword here, and then I'm going to copy that onto my clipboard. I'm going to come back into my input watcher and paste it in the input ID. Now, if you're working on your own app and you don't see this ID attribute here at the bottom, you can find it when you go into settings. So I'm just going to make this a little bit smaller, go into my settings, into my general, and down here it's going to say expose the option to add an ID attribute to HTML elements, and all the way to the right you want to make sure that's checked. So now the watch input A is going to watch the input called keyword, and it's going to make that value available faster than the input itself is made available. So then I'm going to come back into my repeating group and into my search, and instead of saying input keywords value, I'm going to say watch input A's value. I'm going to copy that expression and come into my conditional, and I'm going to paste that here as well. And now when I type in fall, it's so much faster and it doesn't have that same hiccup that it had before. And that's how we're going to search by keyword. Now we're going to add search by name. So moving into the search, I'm going to come in here and grab and go into this search box. So this is like searching for the interests by name. A search box is going to look through a list of things from the database, if we set it to be dynamic choices, and it's going to allow us to search on a field of our choice. And it's going to find a specific record that we can click on, and then we can filter our list down to that specific record. So I'm going to just change out the field to search here to be the first last, because the slug doesn't really mean anything to us right now. And then I'm going to go into my repeating group, and I'm going to add a constraint, and it's going to be the same constraint that I used for the interest, where the unique ID equals the search box by name's value, unique ID. And then remember, I want to do that on a conditional one as well. So unique ID equals the search box by name's values unique ID. So if I just refresh my page and I search for my name, I find it and I'm able to narrow down just to my profile. And then I can click in here and I type Emily, and Emily will come up and I'll be able to switch it to Emily's, no problem. The trick is when I type in here, let's go ahead and clear this out. So if I type in fall, this is Adams. Now I can type in my name, and when I click it, nothing shows up because I don't have fall in my profile. So what I can do is a couple different things. When I select one here, I can clear out any of the previous filters so that it will go to that one specific person's profile. Or I can make an attempt, and we can see if this works, of filtering the options in this drop down to the ones that would match the filters. I don't think I'll be able to do the yes, no inclusive with that, but I can at least get it for the filter by company and the fall. So let's go in here and let's go to our search by name and our appearance and our list of profiles, and we'll add those two constraints. So we can say the company equals the drop down filter company's value, and then we can say that any field contains the input keywords value. The sort by will be by created date, and we'll have admin portals descending as the descending. So just like we'll make it look almost exactly like the search on the repeating group, and then we're going to ignore empty constraints. And this will allow us to at least see what's available per these fields that are already filtered. And for the isActive one, what we can do is we can right click and we can start edit the workflow. And when this search box is changed, we can clear out that dropdown. So we can't set the dropdown's value directly, but we can reset a group around the dropdown. So if I right click on this isActive dropdown and I select the first parent, currently it's in this big group, the tab button group. So I'm going to right click on it again, and I'm going to group it in its own column container. Oh, that was a little messy. Let's try a fixed container. Let's try group elements in a fixed container. And look at this, and this is a row. So a fixed container might mess things up responsively, but it'll get our point across for now. So if I go to first parent, it's called group H, and we'll call group reset active dropdown. And then back in our workflow, when we're running this, we want to reset data on the reset group. And that should reset it so that it doesn't affect our filters anymore. So let's just give it a try here. So I'm going to go ahead and filter by company first, and then I'm going to come in here and I'm going to type my name, and nothing comes up. It won't allow me to find who I am. So then I'm going to take this out, and I'll leave that there, and I'll say is active, and now I just have this one person, and I type in Tanya, it doesn't show up. I type in Adam, and when I select, it resets the is active. So if I was able to find it within here, then it doesn't matter the active status, it just resets it. So I think that's working. I'm not sure what you prefer. I probably would prefer just to clear out the other ones and go ahead and allow people to search with using the search by name as many times as they want, but it was an interesting experiment. All right, so we have all of our filters working, and now we need to be able to add and invite an admin to the app. Inviting an admin to the app, we're going to come in and grab this button, add a workflow, and we're going to go ahead and show our pop-up for adding an admin. Actually, we should probably go ahead and reset just in case. So reset the data of the admin pop-up, and the pop-up add admin user, and then we want to show it. And then we're going to come into our pop-up add admin user. All it's asking for is an email, which is already set up for us. So we just need to work on the workflows for the X button here. So let's add a workflow here. We'll go ahead and reset the data of the pop-up, and then we'll hide the pop-up. And then now we need to invite the admin. So here we're going to use a new action called create an account for someone else. The email we're going to choose is the input admin user email value. We're going to return the user if the account already exists, so that way we can also send the email even if the account already exists. So we can't duplicate emails in the database. So if I already have a user with that email in the database, then it's going to go ahead and set the inactive to no, and it's going to set the role to app admin. Then the next action here, I'm going to want to send whoever I'm inviting to the app I'm going to want to send them a reset password email. So I'm going to come here and send password reset email to the same input as before, the input admin user emails value. Now I'm going to change the language in here. It's not going to change the language of the link. I don't actually have access to the language of the link that's sent in this email, but it will change the language of the subject. You've been invited. I don't know why I deleted that. You have been invited to Who's Who. And we can change this text to the Who's Who directory. Just click the link below to set your password. All right, so it's not going to be perfect, but it is going to at least give them the ability to come into reset their password. We could change the language of this email entirely and also change the state on the reset password page if we were to make the token and not send the email. That's a little bit beyond the scope of what we have time to do in this tutorial. So if you would like to know how to do that, please go and join us for a complimentary office hours session. All right, so this will handle that. And then the last but not least, we want to reset the pop-up and go ahead and close the pop-up. All right, and let's see if it works. So we're going to update the page, click on the add admin button. I'm going to add Tanya McGarr +7@gmail.com. I'm going to click invite admin. It's going to close out the pop-up. Now I'm going to go check my email. And again, you have to bear with me with this messy email inbox that I have. And you can see Tanya's Who's Who. You've been invited to Who's Who. And I can click reset here, and it takes me to my 404 page. So we'll go ahead and assume that's working. We'll double check on it later. But that gives us all of the functionality that we intended for our user section. Now we just need to change this dynamic text here. So we'll come back into the design. And we'll use the same logic as before. We'll insert the RG's profiles, list of profiles count, and then we'll say users. Excellent. So let's just recap real quick. We have now done all of what we intended for our, we've touched on custom states for our sorting. We have not touched on hidden variables just yet. In our displaying information, we have done our sorting, so that's done. We've completed everything we were intending there. And for our storing and moving data around, we just have one last thing to talk about, which is reusables. And hidden variables and reusables, I think that's it in terms of our list, and then also deploying live. So the difference between the live and test environments, and then we'll have a conversation about backend workflows. All right, so we can go ahead and complete our users section and our admin portal in general. And before we move on to the profile page, portal reset 44, we're going to circle back and refactor our home page, login, and account page with a reusable called the header. So I'm going to come into my page here, and I did have a header here already, and I've deleted it. So if you want to go ahead and delete yours so we can start fresh with a new one, I'm going to come into my home page, and something I didn't point out before when we were looking at the home page is that our our header is actually a floating group. And what that means is a floating group will stay in place. It won't move against everything else on the page that's moving. Now that's really hard to see and understand with our home page the way that it is. First, the debug mode makes it really tricky. And second, we don't have enough content on the page to require a scroll to see all of the page's content. So what I want to go do now is I want to come in and make the minimum height of this page something really large, like 3000. And then I'll refresh this page. That will give us the scroll so you can see that our header stays put. It doesn't scroll off of the page when we move everything else on the page. So that is something that we want to retain. If you are going to anchor the floating group anywhere other than the top, like if you wanted to do a bottom footer that was a floating group, then you wouldn't be able to achieve that in a reusable. I think we can get away with it though, making the header itself a floating group. So first I'm going to pop back in here and just make this 980 again, which is much more reasonable. Now I'm going to click into our header wrapper floating group, and I'm going to right click and I'm going to replace the element type, and I want to make it actually I don't want to replace, I want to convert to a reusable element, and I want to call it the header. Now this header looks a bit strange, so let's go ahead and fix that. So we're going to do a container layout for the header. It's going to go ahead and be a row. We want the width for the UI builder to be at least like 900 or something like that. So let's go with 1200. I have a wide enough screen for that. The height itself, the minimum height here, we probably don't want to have a minimum height. Maximum height, we can make it 75. Well, I guess we'll put the minimum height at 75. We really want it to be kind of fixed there. So this gives us our header that we're looking for. Now inside the group here, the header wrapper group, which is inside of our reusable header, everything should be the way that we left it. Let's just take a look at the minimum width is 0, minimum height, it's fitting the height to the content. It looks like we might have more content in it than we have available to us in that 75 that we chose, especially because at the top we've got a 20, at the bottom we've got a 20. That doesn't leave very much for what's in the middle here. So in the middle, if I'm looking at this, hovering over, looks like it's 48. So 48 plus another 40 is going to give us 88. And I said that our height was going to be fixed at 75. So I'm going to come back and just update this. Let's go ahead and make it 88. Let's say 88. Like that, and that should give us enough room for everything. Now that I have my header, I don't have to worry about trying to keep up with everything everywhere on 3 different pages, 4 different pages. So I can go ahead and replace this image with my logo that we set up from the app settings in the admin portal. So I'm going to go ahead and clear this, and we'll insert dynamic image, and we'll do a search for app settings, first items, logo, processed with Imagix, and it says to rescale. So now let's just go ahead and drop this reusable element back onto the page. So you can see when I converted it to a reusable element, it made the type of element a group, and then it made this stayed as a floating group. The group that we converted came in as a whole group in here. We don't want it to float relative to the floating group here, so really I'm just going to right click on this one and replace the element type and make this into a group. All right, and then I'm going to change this and just say G instead of floating group. It'll just be a group. Now what I can do is we can test my theory out. We can say, let's make this header a floating group, and we'll have it float to the top and to the left. And now we'll come into our home page, and we will remove the header. We'll scroll down to the bottom here for our reusable elements. We'll grab the header, and then we'll come and just draw it on the page. You don't have to draw the whole thing. It kind of picks up what it's supposed to do. And now I'm going to preview my home page, and you can see it's here, but it's not transparent. It has a solid white background, and we want to change that. So we're going to just click into the header here and go edit the element. We have to edit the element because reusables are not on the page. Like, the elements that are within a reusable group are not technically considered to be on the page where the reusable element is placed. That means there's a division between the page and the reusable as far as transferring information into and out of and around reusables goes. So in order to make changes to the header, so from the home page, I have to click into this reusable, and I can tell it's a reusable with this label here. So I click it open, and I can click edit element, and it opens up the reusable to make changes. So I'm just going to come into the header itself, and then I see this flat color here, and I just want to say none. And then I'll refresh the page, and now it looks like it did before. It's clear, and I've got my logo here, my new logo. So then now I can go to my other pages, and I can drop this on the page as well. So I can come into my account page, and I can delete the header, grab it here, and just draw it on the page. I can do that with my login page. If you ever click something on the left-hand side and then decide you need to do something else first, you can click this cursor button. It will unselect whatever you selected on the left. So come in here, and I'm going to delete the header. Yep, and then I'm going to place it back on the page. And then I'm going to, let's see, we've got the home, we've got login, and we've got account. So let's do it for the portal page. So the portal page, the header is a little bit different, so we'll treat it differently. It looks more like the admin portal's header. So we might have to have, well, not might, we'll have two separate headers. Let's look at the profile page. That has the original header design. So we'll just go ahead and remove it and add the header in. And the reset password page, this is all messy, so we'll delete it. Delete the old header, and we can draw the new header on. And the 404 page, we can delete the old header and just drop the new one on. All right, so now our header is in different places. Some other things to notice about the reusable element. It is considered a container element. It is a group of a sort. Now when I want to make changes to the header, I don't have to go and make changes in all of those different places. I make one change here, and it makes it everywhere else in the app where that reusable exists. Now, in order for it to show up differently in different places, I have to, let me just delete this one more time. In order to get the header to behave differently in different places, I have to be able to detect what page I'm on, or I have to figure out how to send information into the reusable itself. From the top level of the reusable, you'll notice that I can set the type of content. So I can set it to user, app settings, anything I want. So let's go ahead and just set it to user here. Then in order to set the data source on this type of content for this reusable, it's going to need to happen on the page level. So if I say it's going to be of type user, then wherever I've used the header before, like my account here, I can now set that data source from here. I can say it's going to be the current user, or I can say it's going to be the current page user if the pages element was a user. So that's how you can, that's one way you can pass information into a reusable. Another way you can pass information into the reusable is through the URL parameters. So every element has access to the URL. So if I want to get something from the URL, I just type get data from the URL. I can pick it up from a parameter, or I can pick it up from a path. Either one, it doesn't matter which, and I can always set what type of data it's going to be, and that's another way to pass information into the reusable. But I don't have to pass it into the reusable from the page in order to get it from the URL, because right within the element itself, I have access to the page itself. So I can say when I get data from the page URL, and I can make anything happen on the page that I want. I have access to that here in the design. I have access to that here in the workflows. I have access to that within other elements in the reusable. Every element, whether it's on a page or in a reusable, has access to the URL. What it doesn't have access to is states on the page. So the reusable does not have access to the page or other reusable where it is placed. It cannot see into its own container because technically it's not contained in just one place. It could be contained in multiple places. So for that reason, if I'm going to need to know information in the reusable from the page that's not available in the URL, and it can't be passed as a data type into the reusable itself, I'm going to have to use custom states or parameters through workflows to get the information in there. So I can take the top level of the reusable, and I can, just like I would on a page, I can set its state here. So this is top level state 1, and I'm going to make it of type text. And now I can set the state of this custom state from any page where the reusable is placed. So on my account page in my workflow, when the page is loaded, if I want to set the text of that reusable, I can go to my element actions, set state, choose my header, and choose my top level state 1 and send whatever data into it that I would like. Another option for sending information into a reusable is through its workflows. So I can set a custom event. We've used custom events before on the page level, but within a reusable, I can say custom data. I can add whatever data I would like here. So I can say parameter 1 and set it as a text, and parameter 2 and set it as a number. And now I have access to send data into this workflow and do with it whatever I would like, because as you can see, if I decide to create a new thing, and I can say the app name is going to be parameter 1 or parameter 2. So I have the ability to come to my account page, and I can trigger a custom event from a reusable element. This allows me to send in parameter 1. This is some text, or parameter 2, which would be a number. It's going to require a number. If I just type in text here, it will take 1 because it won't take my text because it's set to be a number. And this is another way that I can pass information into my reusable element from the page. Now, getting information back out of the reusable back to the page is a little trickier. I cannot just trigger a custom event on a particular page because the reusable doesn't know which page or other reusable it's going to be placed within. What I have to do is I have to communicate it through the URL parameters or page paths, just like we do from the page. We can do that in the reusable as well. Or I have to set a state on that top level, state of the reusable, and then I can click here and I can do when a condition is true. So only when the header's top level state is something in particular, then I can run an action on the page. And those are the ways that you can send information into and out of a reusable. That's sort of your reusable primer. There's a lot to it, and it is tricky, but it is useful to know how to utilize the reusable element as one of the ways to pass information in and around your app, right? So that's this conversation that we've been having here. The reason it's useful is because the more elements that you have on a page, the heavier that page load is, and it's going to take time. Now, Bubble is getting much faster at this these days than it used to be a year or even 2 years ago. It was super slow sometimes. The more elements we had on a page, the longer the user had to wait for it to load. But even more important, in my opinion, was the fact that it was taking forever to work within the editor itself. By compartmentalizing your workflows and your elements into reusables, you're able to make your editor much faster and stay very organized as you work, which is really important for your efficiency as you're building. All right, so now that we've taken care of our reusable, let's just go ahead and move back into our, profile mode.